welcome everybody to the third and final day of our 2021 UMCA Agroforestry Symposium. So if you've been able to join us for the past couple of days, you'll know that we've been talking about ways to build resilient and healthy communities through our food system and the role that agroforestry plays in that. And so today we're really delighted to start off our final session with Dr. Darren Chapman to talk about his work in building resilient food systems, especially in these times that are really challenging on our food systems and our communities as a whole. So we're pleased to welcome Dr. Darren Chapman. He's a project coordinator with the University of Missouri Interdisciplinary Center for Food Security and holds a PhD in Rural Sociology from MU with a graduate minor in public health. He believes that the power of research and science is realized when it is rooted in and benefiting communities. Operating under the assumption that all communities hold strengths that can be lifted up, his work seeks to build capacity that allows individuals the opportunity to lead their best lives. His current research focuses on food pantries and emergency food systems. Darren, you can go ahead and start sharing your screen now.
Good to have you all here on this Saturday morning. It is early and we're gonna really dive into a few issues with this presentation. And I promise it is going to deal with resiliency and topics pertinent to agroforestry and building strong food systems. I'll kind of try to wrap it all in a nice bow, but I think through this presentation and through a discussion later on, I think we'll really get into what is the messiness of emergency food systems at times and some of the difficulties that exist in working in and through this system to promote equity and equitable access to healthy foods for individuals. So thank you everyone, and we'll go ahead and get started. So today we're going to have a brief introduction to what emergency food systems are. I know we had an individual identify that they're from England. I'm not as familiar with the emergency food systems in that context, but we'll kind of give an overview of how they developed here in the US and then dive into 3 different studies that I've been a part of, looking at the Grow Well Missouri program, which was a gardening and capacity building program, moving on to a statewide survey of pantry directors and looking at how these services are structured and how that would then inform implementation of programs. And then also some COVID-19 work that I've been participating with our center and looking at how pantries are responding to the pandemic and how it's actually changed the services that they offer. And then go into a few discussion points and implications for this work, and then open it up for those questions, which I think are going to be the most fun part of this conversation. So for an introduction, just really important to give that contextual background, I think, of hunger and how it's addressed, because I think that from a systems perspective, which is how I generally approach things, that we have to understand the systems that things are created in or that they emerge from to really understand how we can work within them. And so despite the abundance and general affordability of food in the United States, there are a large number of individuals that can't access food or have insecurities related to their food access. Right before the pandemic, this was setting at about 11.5%, with 4.5 to 4.9% of households actually seeing hunger in the United States, so changing their eating patterns because of a lack of access to food. And these numbers are a little bit concerning in that we don't have as good information post COVID-19, in which we've seen a lot of economic instability, a lot of job loss, and these numbers are likely quite a bit higher. But what we're seeing though is that even in a land of plenty, we still have a lot of issues with food access. So historically, the US has actually addressed hundreds of issues through publicly funded programs. And this has been done to help through the purchase and redistribution of food commodities through programs like SNAP, WIC, TANF, and CSFP, which is a commodity food box program for the aging. And these publicly funded responses to hunger have largely followed national and political trends. Food stamps were developed during the Great Depression, reinstated by John F. Kennedy during his presidency, and greatly expanded by the Johnson administration in the War on Poverty. However, with the growth of neoliberalism, we've actually seen an emphasis on the decentralization of these services and movement away from federally funded programs. And we've seen this rise of private assistance within hunger relief. And that is where the emergency food system falls. And so the first food bank was actually started in 1967, but has grown to over 200 food banks currently in the Feeding America network. And so these food banks are distributing food to over 46 million unique clients each year in the United States. And so we've actually seen an 81% increase in the utilization of food pantries in the US since 1997. And it's not surprising that the utilization of these programs is often tied to economic instability or insecurities. And so we saw a big rise in the number of individuals utilizing emergency food systems during the Great Recession. But what I think is important to note is that they don't end when the economic instability ends. We actually saw after the Great Recession this continued rise of dependency on food pantries to obtain the food that these households need. And so this really falls in line with some of the research that we've done with the University of Missouri that has found that individuals are relying on food pantries for a greater portion of their food to meet household needs, and relying on it for longer periods of time. And so we see this institutionalization of this resource. And with this institutionalization, there needs to be, I would say, an investigation to what is going on here and how is this resource meeting the needs of the individuals using it. So within this slide here is two pictures that I actually personally took in 2 separate months while visiting food pantries to participate in the Grow Well Missouri program. So as you can see, the food that people are getting 1 month as compared to the other is very different. And so given the charitable nature of food pantry services, users are at the mercy of donations in regards to the health, quality, and availability, with users reporting deficits are deficient and undesirable food options at times. As you can see on the right-hand side, getting a cartload of corn pops and Cheez-Its and fruit snacks isn't going to really meet your dietary needs for the month that you're actually visiting that food pantry. And so we're seeing that it isn't just this one food pantry during this 1 month, but that fruit and vegetable consumption is generally lower among food pantry clients, often eating reduced quantities of fruits and vegetables and fiber. And often we're seeing that many pantries only provide fresh fruits and vegetables during a portion of the year. And the fresh fruits and vegetables that they do provide are often less nutrient dense options like potatoes and onions, more of your shelf stable items that are able to be stored longer and easier. And so once again, I think these things are pointing back to some of the things that we'll get into in this study, and that the systems and structures and infrastructures that are in place are really shaping the services that are offered through these emergency food systems. So it's not just access to food, but the unintended or consequences of them. And what we're seeing is a lot of health disparities among food pantry clients. In a survey of Missouri food pantry clients, we actually saw dietary related illnesses occurring at much higher rates than the regional average that corresponded with where they were located. Some of these are even more concerning with diabetes. You're seeing at over twice the prevalence among food pantry users. and high blood pressure and high cholesterol also related to those things. So you're seeing a lot of heart issues as well. So there are these consequences going on. So with this going on, like what's happening here? Why is critical evaluation often slow to judge emergency, or not judge, but investigate and really posit opportunities for solutions within emergency food? And Janet Poppendieck in her seminal work identified this as the halo effect, and that because of the charitable nature of food pantries, we are often slow to criticize them. I've talked to many food pantry directors where they say people should be happy or will be happy with whatever they can get. Something is always better than nothing when it comes to food. And I think this is kind of a flawed understanding of how equitable this service is and how well it is actually providing for the individuals that come to utilize them. And so we talk about it in this way. We form a dialogue about charity and what that means, and then we're able to gloss over some of those negative health outcomes. We put it off, and we also have this tendency to talk about food pantries as a fairly homogenous organization, and this is a very flawed understanding of what food pantries are. For anyone that's ever been to them, or a number of food pantries, you'll often see that the way that people structure the environment of the food pantry differs. They can range from small closets in churches to large spaces that look a lot like a food or a supermarket that you would go to, or a large warehouse even. So the physical spaces are different. The ways in which you engage can be different. The information you have to provide to even receive food varies widely. And so we're seeing that these are not homogeneous organizations, but treating them really creates some issues. And so getting into the first research study, or the first project, I want to talk about Grow Well Missouri, which was a program started by the Interdisciplinary Center that really emerged out of some work that we were doing in food pantries and some survey work, in which we found a large number of individuals within a region of Missouri who are using food pantries had this background in growing their own food. There was this knowledge base, but a lot of them didn't have access to it. And our center was seeing this space and an opportunity to not only engage with this knowledge base, but use it as a catalyst for conversation and capacity building within communities. And so it really focused on the distribution of gardening materials and education, and flourished through one-on-one conversations with a lot of the pantry clients to create an environment in which we could look a little bit deeper at building capacity within these communities that we are working in. And so, like I was saying, the Grow Well program itself was really trying to address health disparities identified among those pantry clients like we were talking about, by increasing the capacity of local food pantries to initiate programs, projects, and policies to increase access to the consumption of healthy food by pantry customers. And specifically also looking to do that through allowing individuals to grow their own fruits and vegetables in home and community gardens. So that was really, like I was saying, the vehicle for entrenching a capacity building approach and a community-centered approach, and looking at how can we not just put this program in here, but how can we look at this community and help this community see all the resources that it has, because there are often these resources that aren't connecting, and form collaborations. And this was done through the development of wellness teams. And if Bill McKelvey happens to be on the call today, hopefully we can get him in on the conversation, as he was really the center of this project. But these wellness teams were developed in collaboration not only with the food pantries, but also with key members and stakeholders in those communities that had access into different arenas of the food system. And so we would engage with FFA, we would engage with local farmers, we would engage with the local markets owners, and really create spaces for dialogue and thinking about what could be done in this community to really progress access to healthy food options and create kind of this food culture within the pantry itself. And we also made them to where they were reflexive, in which we weren't just initiating these programs or policies, but looking at what are the consequences of them. There was this feedback loop through a lot of evaluation work that was driven through the client response. And so all of it was really focusing on what are the actual outcomes that clients are seeing, and are these things actually working? And so we found that a lot of people that accessed our materials actually utilize them. 85% of people picking up seeds, transplants, or education utilize them. And 90% of those that did reported success in gardening, whether it be their first garden or they've been gardening for 40 years, they reported varying levels of success. And it's happy to say that the majority of them reported very productive gardens in the time that we were working with them in various communities, with a number reporting increased garden size, increased garden productivity, increased ability to not only preserve their produce, so they're producing beyond what they can consume and are storing it back, but also sharing their produce. So creating this culture in which people are able to engage with others. One of my favorite opportunities we ever had was this local youth who came into the food pantry one day with just a box of gourds, and they were so excited because they had grown these gourds from the Grow Well, Missouri supplies, and were actually donating back to the food pantry. And so it was creating a reflexivity and just this idea of cooperation within the emergency food system in that community as well. And I think a lot of that had to do with the trust that was being built and that culture that was kind of shifting within the food pantry through this program. And so we did see some success, but there are also some issues that were really highlighted within this. And so when you start thinking about how sustainable or how resilient are these programs, ideas of community support and leadership are so critical to take into consideration, especially within the emergency food system. Food pantries are often run by volunteers, and not only that, but volunteers who are often older and operating on shoestring budgets in places that they often don't have the infrastructure when it comes to space to really do the things that they would necessarily want to do. And so there's this community support that really has to be developed to see these things be successful. And also this idea of leadership, how the passion and vision that these leaders often have really shapes not only do we engage in programs, but how do we roll them out? Do we source funding for them? Can we support them in the long run? And so breaking these down a little bit more, we see that volunteerism, like I was saying, really being not only to our benefit, but also to a detriment, in that if people don't have enough volunteers to distribute food, it's hard to think that we're going to be able to roll out these programs within these contexts and think that they're going to have the resources needed to operate not only the essential part of what their mission is, but also these alternatives. And so we have people reporting we don't seem to have the volunteers that we need to do these things. And this is pre-pandemic, which to keep in mind. And we see that pantries often say you see these things failing at times because of a lack of volunteers. They have volunteers in and out. And so what we saw here is that you can't really rely on that organization itself, but creating partnerships and thinking about not only how do we create it now, but long term, having replacement strategies for when people leave, when you have turnover, and thinking long term when it comes to volunteerism, and making sure it's not extractive, I think is really important. And you're not overtaxing certain individuals and relying on them to do everything, which can and does often happen because of that passion that we'll talk about here in just a second. And then there's this idea of place, and that if any of us are community engaged workers or scholars, I think we all know that every place has its quirks. And we had one individual really state it well, and that this community is really funny when something first starts. There's a little hesitancy to see if it's successful. And so this program was working in rural areas where people feel burned, people feel left behind, people feel like there's something that comes in, it blossoms, and then it just leaves really suddenly. And this often is the case within emergency food systems. And I think it's really critical in thinking, how do we establish things that are resilient within these resources, and not just going to be kind of a flash in the pan based upon a funding opportunity. And some of that comes through this development of partnerships. And this really emerged as a key to success and longevity with the Grow Well program, in looking at what are things that exist in the communities. And within one, it was the Master Gardeners, which is a part of Extension here in Missouri. And this program actually came in, brought their knowledge, brought their expertise, and really took over this program and created this exit strategy for our team to pull back and for them to take it on and work with local garden shops to continue. And so we're seeing that you can start creating trust in a place. You can move past that hesitancy and really, through a capacity building approach, start seeing opportunities for change, even within the most rural context, the most challenging context when it comes to operating programs and thinking about access to food. And so we move past the place, the concept, the larger space, and really get into also individual traits that are really important. And that can be boiled down into passion and vision of the leadership. And I have found that food pantry workers are so incredibly passionate about what they do. They want to give back. They see it as their duty to their community to really provide for individuals that they love and want to see do well, but also see that their community isn't meeting those needs. And a lot of times they need help in sourcing that funding. And some of that also comes back to time that they have if they're volunteers, trying to find the time to write grants, connect with individuals while also securing however many thousands of pounds of food or boxes that they're distributing through their pantry can be a really daunting task. And that these financial barriers really are a tripping stone, and provide us that space for looking at how can we start looking at the system more holistically to promote these programs. And I think part of it is then not relying on these programs to have to search out and fund all of these things on themselves. So looking once again at a larger level, stop looking at the pantry as the only place of intervention. And we'll get into that a little bit more in the discussion, and widening our kind of the net that we cast when it comes to discussion of resiliency, specifically within the emergency food system. So we're going to shift gears just a little bit, but it is still very related, because in my work with Grow Well Missouri, I started seeing, like I was saying, that pantries are really structured quite differently. And we also lacked a really a true understanding of what pantry services look like in the state of Missouri. And so I did a statewide survey of pantry directors to create profiles of how they structure their services, to really highlight maybe some of the areas or provide insight into areas of why things may not be working, or to provide insight into avenues for how can we make programs better. And what we were finding is that we have a lot of small pantries in our state. And I think also more nationally, we have some large pantries in our urban centers, but there are still a lot of really small pantries. So your average pantry was only open 9 days a month for about 36 hours, served 271 households. But often they are reporting serving more individuals. And this was also conducted, I will say, in 2018, so just before the pandemic. And so we were still seeing pantry serving more people even before the economic pressures that we're seeing with COVID-19. And so you have an average monthly volunteer, 33, and the majority are religiously affiliated. The majority of pantries also provide provisions once a month, so you have individuals coming in, and most commonly clients receive a predetermined or package selection of food, where the majority of the handling is done by volunteers and staff. So we're seeing this space that is very much a top-down approach to service delivery, in which we have the pantry doing most of the work and just giving out these predetermined boxes. And we have a movement within emergency foods and food justice to see like a shopper model approach, but that isn't the most commonly utilized approach to pantry services. And I think it creates this environment or an understanding of how interactions are actually occurring, and oftentimes create a really interesting dynamic of even engaging with clients in this sector. And so moving on, we also see that directors and workers are mostly white, female, high school diploma, and interestingly, I think, come from financially secure backgrounds, not only currently, but also growing up and never utilizing food pantry services. So there's this disconnect oftentimes where pantry directors don't necessarily understand the experiences of clients coming in. And so I think that is also another one of those barriers that we have to start looking at and breaking down. How can we create a level of understanding that promotes these programs that seek to improve the food system, improve access, improve our entire food environment, both physical and health-wise. And it's really just pointing to some of these larger structural issues that are going on. And so within this survey, we also looked at what type of supports were being given, and this was done to also better understand that food pantries aren't necessarily homogenous organizations. And through the survey, I was also developed some typologies for what type of pantries actually existed out there. And I'm not going to get into a lot of detail with this analysis, but what I will say is that we see the majority actually fit within the traditional pantry construct, where they give out their direct food provisions, they don't provide a lot of other supports or referrals, and they just do food. I had a lot of individuals on a quantitative survey actually find a way to write in, "We only do food because of frustrations," and asking if they do additional or provide additional supports or referrals through their pantry. But we also see that there is a growing number or a small number of organizations that are moving beyond just providing food and looking at larger issues, more structural issues to poverty that are bringing individuals into their systems. So they're looking at systemic supports from helping individuals vote, to helping them with GED, to utility assistance, housing assistance, making sure those other needs are met, and also focusing on publicly funded programs that provide much more support for food purchasing for their household. So the last study I want to hit on before we move into a few of the implications and start our question and answer is COVID-19 food pantry response. And it's really important to understand that COVID-19 has really affected all areas of our lives. And it has really affected emergency food systems. I think, so this background here is a picture of a food pantry line that was actually in Grand Rapids. But these were all over the news. We saw that people were really struggling and looking to food pantries for support at the beginning of COVID-19. And we've seen that decrease a little bit, or we've had it reported that it has decreased just a little bit as pantries have figured out how to structure their services to better meet needs, as public funded programming has provided more supports for individuals during this unprecedented time. And we really saw this as an opportunity to look at what is actually going on with food pantries to meet the need of their communities. And I think it's really important to think about these shifts because there's going to be a continued need for programming that looks at improving food access for individuals, looking at the equity of those things and the systemic issues that are driving food pantry utilization, but how capable food pantries are in meeting that need, I think is going to be even more taxed. So pantries have largely stayed open. And I think a lot of that has to do with the passion that we talked about of food pantry directors. We did focus groups with pantry directors across the state of Missouri between March and June of this year, and looked at kind of what were their strategies for staying open, how they make decisions, what was that driving force, concerns with sustainability moving forward. And what we have found is that pantries really felt the need to stay open. The directors were more than willing to take on personal risk, even though a lot of them, as we talked about, are older, more susceptible to COVID-19 with pre-existing conditions. And they were just, so many people told me, it's what we do. Delivering food to people in our communities is what we do, and we're going to do it if it kills us or not. And so that commitment to this distribution of food, to meeting a need, meeting this calling, does have some consequences. I had one individual tell me, I live for what I do, but it's taken a mental toll on me. I soak in all the situations that people are telling me about, and the responsibility lies on me as the one responsible for everyone that comes here. And so they're really taking on these pressures. These are very caring individuals. And they said they just keep going because, you know, that's the responsibility that we have to serve others. And the same individual went on to talk about how their self-care hasn't been able to be there because they're so focused on providing care for others, and that they've actually noticed that they're drinking more and losing some of those things that they do are able to do to take care of themselves because of not only the stress that they have related to the COVID-19, but also the stress that they have for everyone else in their community who has lost jobs, who has lost housing, who has lost opportunity to pay for electricity, and meeting the needs of people that they are in contact with and in community with on a daily basis. And so food pantries have not only stayed open to serve people in the ways that they have before, but they've also taken on new roles. We saw in a lot of these small communities with stay-at-home orders put in place that a lot of places that provided services before had closed down and didn't have a physical location for individuals to access those public services that they needed. And so we had one pantry director tell us about someone they had call in, and this client had an issue with their insurance. And whereas they would used to call Family Services or the Department of Health and Senior Services, they couldn't do that anymore. And so they reached out to their pantry director, the person that they had built a trusting relationship with, to help them work through, how do I obtain and keep my insurance during this time? And so we're seeing pantry directors who aren't often qualified become the community service or community health workers within these spaces, in addition to distributing food. And there's a lot of concerns I have related to that. But it's really important to note that a lot of the clients do look to these spaces to provide services beyond just the food that they're receiving from them. Another director also helped their client get into their online banking system to make sure their bills were able to be paid because their community bank was closed and they couldn't go into it. And it's also important to note that a lot of individuals utilizing some of these pantries are older. And so facing constraints with technology, access to where it's a lot easier and there's a preference to go into a physical location to solve some of these issues, that they just weren't able to do it. And pantry directors are just having to be ready for a number of different things. And so, like I said, they're taking on these things, and there's these additional stresses. And I think it's really important to think about the resiliency of these networks and these specific organizations. I think we can see that emergency foods are resilient. They have done nothing but grow since their development in the 1960s through the 80s. So I think emergency food systems are here to stay, but from a specific organization, a specific pantry, there's issues of sustainability moving forward. And a lot of it comes from a reliance on volunteers, how we structure these services. As individuals closed down services inside their pantries and went to drive-through models, they rely on volunteers even more, oftentimes older volunteers who are having to package more, carry more, take on more responsibilities, and also relying on fewer volunteers to keep people physically safe so they can practice social distancing. So pantry directors expressed fear that they were pushing themselves too hard, but also that they were having to do more work with less volunteers, and they were having to rely on volunteers that were in a high-risk population. So thinking about moving beyond that and seeing a space for change within their organizations is really important within this time. And that they were seeing upwards to 30% loss in their volunteer force. And so really, to try to wrap these things up and how we can think about resiliency and sustainability within these programs, I think is really important. From the concept of sustainability, looking at environmental practices, the types of food that are distributed, the health and wellness of the individuals is really critical. to evaluating within an emergency food system, implementing more justice-oriented approaches that take into account the health and wellness of individuals, that look deeper into systemic supports is really important. But how can we do that within a context where you have limited volunteers, limited space, limited time, limited funds, and still acknowledging the critical role that these organizations play in their communities? And I think a lot of it really comes from this idea of capacity building and a structural approach to understanding how to implement these programs. Like was said in my bio, I believe all communities have strengths, and that through connection, we are able to engage with others in our communities and create networks that don't just focus on the one organization to meet the needs. We saw in small rural Missouri communities, food pantries partner with schools, with the Master Gardener program, with Extension, to provide education, to provide access to plants and seeds and preservation technique opportunities. And we were able to not just rely on the volunteers at that organization, and they were able to engage with a younger volunteer base as the FFA started volunteering to come in to move some of their canned foods for them, to load it up in cars. We're seeing that capacity building really has an effect in the long run of how well these programs are able to be carried out and the opportunity that we have. And so it's really important, especially to move beyond just the single pantry. We can often get focused on the one point of interaction that we have, but we need to look beyond that to food banks, where you have a lot more resources, whether it be financial resources, whether it be equipment, distribution channels, knowledge, and start looking upstream of the food pantry and how can we engage with these larger organizations to help meet the needs of the pantries to implement these programs. And COVID-19, once again, has increased the burden on this resource. Food banks are gaining much more visibility. They were in the news. And so it does provide that platform for conversation, and really investigating and calling into question, I think, is really important with that increased visibility. In some of our conversations with Feeding Missouri this last year, some food banks were reporting an increase in 40% in client requests for food assistance during COVID-19. And if you remember that graph earlier on, the Great Recession saw an uptick, but that didn't quit for another 5 years after the Great Recession ended. And so this is a lasting trend that I think we're going to see. It isn't just going to drop off as jobs come back, as the economy rebounds, but I think we're going to see long-term effects from COVID-19. And we're going to have to really rethink and reshape how we do things. And I think that comes from those regional food banks providing more support to pantries, to increase information on community resources, helping them apply for funding, and looking at distribution models that take into account all the resources that these larger upstream organizations have. And so just wanted to thank you all for your time and patience. Hopefully I wrapped a little bit of a bow on that, and open it up to some questions and comments that anyone has.
Well, thank you so much, Darren. I learned so much. It was a wonderful way to start the morning. First off, we have a question from Susan, who says, I've been trying to establish such a center at a university I've been teaching in collaborative effort with its surrounding communities. It's been very challenging, and I would appreciate any insights and pointers. And I'm assuming Susan, you're talking about a center for interdisciplinary food security or something of that nature. Darren, you have any thoughts or tips for Susan?
Yeah, so university food insecurity is a often under-discussed topic. College students or university students have some of the highest rates of food insecurity when you're looking at specific populations. And there's often a lot of unmet need there. And we've worked a lot with the University of Missouri. Our center has to provide guidance on establishing a food pantry for some students, and it is hard. It is really hard to raise awareness and get people involved. People often see, well, it's true that universities are often a place of privilege historically, and so it's really changing the discussion there, and that it is different for some universities that serve underserved populations. But I think the best way to do it is get involved with your local food bank to have access to foods when it comes, thinking about that structure and getting a connection built there to where you're not having to rely on buying those things. And then finding some unique partnerships. We had some graduate students here on campus really engage with community gardening and establish a larger community garden here on campus, and look at opportunities for food recovery programs within the university through the sustainability office, and just think creatively about how can we not just look at it from the model that works at normal food pantries, but how can we make it fit to within the context of a university? College students eat a little bit differently than others. They often don't have access to ways to cook things. So I think creative thinking is one of the best ways to engage with that. But it is difficult. It's really hard.
Yeah, I see that Mary Hendrickson, who's also involved with that center, drops some more information about it in the chat. But yeah, thanks for that answer, Darren. So we have almost more of a comment from Deborah, but I think it leads into a question that I wanted to pose. She says some food pantries that have federal food donations are giving away food that is not healthy. The commodities such as processed cheese and canned meats are not really healthy. These foods are contributing to health disparities. And I know you had mentioned it a little bit earlier in your talk, but for me, I'm hoping you can comment for people, because this is a very big soapbox for myself, the difference between food security and nutritional security, and how that plays into the broader conversation of food justice and food sovereignty.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And I think a lot of it comes from like a breakdown of how many terms we use and how we conceptualize things, and really getting caught up in what these things mean. But food insecurity, I think, does a really good job of incorporating some of that, because it doesn't just look at access to food as a concept, it looks at the health and nutrition of food as well. So the actual definition is enough food to live healthy and nutritious food to live a healthy, active lifestyle. So in conceptualizing that, we can start looking at not only do we have the amount of food we need, like sure, you can have the calories needed, but what is the quality of those calories? And in the emergency food system, it can be also really problematic in how we measure those things or measure success. It's often done in poundage. Historically, food pantries talk about how many pounds of food they distribute. I will note that I was in a pantry one time where some of the pounds of food distributed were gallon bags of mustard. And that is not a healthy, nutritious, or even usable food item on a household scale. And so I think it really comes to re-evaluating what we look at success within an emergency food system. Like working ourselves out of a job is a model I would love to see these organizations take on, rather than a continued growth model. Like how can we not only meet the need, but pivot to address these larger structural issues. And some of that comes from industrial, like relying on industrial food, the engagement that commodity programs has with larger industrial agricultural complex. Like you were saying, we redistribute processed food, we redistribute a lot of dairy, but I mean, not that dairy is bad for you at all, but we have these partnerships between the public and private hunger response. And I think there are opportunities to highlight the good partnerships. During the pandemic, we saw farmers to families boxes, which was a redistribution of agricultural products, mostly fruits and vegetables, through a number of different agencies. And so I think it comes to highlighting those things and those partnerships rather than relying on the historical model that we've typically seen. The Chris Farley sketch, if you're familiar with Saturday Night Live, like eating a lot of government cheese. And so there's rethinking what that could look like, and I think is really important.
Yeah, I mean, I have so many thoughts about this on a regular basis because it is such a complex issue and topic. I think that segues really well into this next question from Kelsey. She wants to know, how do you see agroforestry, and I would add even urban farming, forest farming, and local farming in general, as a food growing model fitting into the emergency food system?
Yeah, I think it is hard. I think that we have to be really careful in looking at these models and looking at where the impetus for change is being placed. So Grow Well Missouri really employed that model as part of the program of how do we provide the individual opportunity to grow their own food, to provide their own food. But I think it's also really important to note that a lot of people engaging or utilizing emergency foods are the working poor. They are working full-time jobs, often multiple part-time jobs, a lot of single parents, a lot of older households. And really, if we see this as the only method of change within the system, I think we have no way to go but to fail, because people just don't have the capacity or space or time. And I think COVID has even highlighted that for single families who are now not only providing, but now are teaching, some of them, as schools have gone to an online platform. So I think it serves as a part of a whole approach. I think it is a really critical part. I think people feel better when they garden. We had so many individuals identify, even just through a container gardening program, just access to growing a pepper plant or a tomato plant. It wasn't so much the food that it provided, but it was the additional benefits that they saw through participation, through engagement, and being outside, being active. I think plants are healing. I think engaging with your food is healing. I think it provides that space for reflection. And I think it can definitely be a part, but I think if you're relying on that to address systemic issues, I think you're gonna fall short unless you really look at the systemic processes going on. And how do we look at those, like urban farming, as a larger system to kind of supplement and engage with emergency foods rather than how can emergency foods do urban farming, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it also brings up this as the system currently exists, right? As our food system currently exists, as our emergency food system currently exists. And you've done a really good job of identifying some of the challenges within these existing systems, which I think leads really well into this next question and comment from an attendee who says, how do those of us that do have years of experience with frontline food insecurities get paid to participate? They say volunteering for 20 plus years on religious farms, farms for the homeless, being on food stamps myself, there's no seat at the table for me. I've been delivering gleaned produce, reallocating seeds, nursery pots, prepared meals, all at my own expense while I myself am unemployed. What is the career sustainable path for people with knowledge but no power, shy of just starting yet another nonprofit?
Yeah, and I think that's a really great point, in that we have so many people that are engaged with these systems, that are providing inputs for these systems. They are often providing some of the best food and produce to be distributed through these systems, but they aren't being paid. It's seen through this idea of charity. And I think it's restructuring and reframing, like going from charity to justice. Like if we could reframe just ever so slightly, to where we aren't relying on people to donate, but instead looking at how can we partner with buying programs through food banks to coordinate distribution models to where we're paying our local farmers, we're paying our local food producers to not only support their business and production, but also provide that input into emergency food systems. So I think there is two sides of that coin, to where you benefit in multiple ways by providing that financial input and looking at where we spend our money to purchase food for emergency food, because there is a lot of food in Missouri. Feeding America food banks receive $10 million of TANF funding each year that is distributed through their food banks to purchase food and coordinate services. And I think that's a lot of money that could support a lot of food production and food acquisition for these systems, and looking at how do we engage more with that and provide resources to back up the thanks that we give to the people that have spent so much of their life donating to these causes and to these efforts. But like the commenter said, they aren't seeing the benefits necessarily.
Yeah, and I really appreciate your comment about how reframing the idea of food not necessarily as charity, but as a source of justice and so many other things. So we have another question from Buwan that says they learned a lot. I really like the Growing Well Missouri program, but it's very difficult to change behavior. Did you notice any changes in the food produce intake among participants compared to the baseline survey?
So that's a really great question. I think looking at what are behavior changes moving forward is often hard, just because of the scale of the program that we were implementing. I will say that a lot of people that were engaged with the gardening program saw an increase in vegetable consumption, not only of what they were producing, but also supplementing. Just because we had some individuals identify like they grew these things, so they would buy something to like formulate a meal around this thing. So it definitely created a space in which they were searching out more. And we had, like I said, the range of participation from gardeners growing a couple pots to an acre or more of production space. And so it looked really differently for a lot of people. And in our survey, people did report eating more, but it's really hard to quantify that without doing a more in-depth study of dietary intake, which we just weren't capable of, and really wasn't quite the focus of the program. But anecdotally, we did have people say that they were able to consume more, and we did have people storing more even. So their gardens weren't just producing for the summer, spring, summer, and fall. They were able to store and rely on some of those items longer into the year. So I think overall, we did see some with increased consumption, but it's really hard to change that behavior when you have inconsistent access or a lack of resources to utilize, prepare, and store those things. Storage is really tough, and fresh produce can be really hard.
Yeah, definitely. So Ben wants to know, are there any examples of health departments addressing chronic health issues and at-risk situations through food pantries or integrating outreach through them, whether that is nutritious food, dietary interventions, preventative community health? It seems like a way to build local capacity and increase the quality of food. Obviously, a challenge for food pantries is how many Americans see obesity as a moral failing, and some see poverty similarly. Can health departments reframe addressing this service? And there's a Chris Farley reference. P.S. Government cheese in a van down by the river.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie. I put that reference into my dissertation defense, so I hold on to the government cheese reference. But I think that is a really important space for engagement, where health departments, extension does a good job in some places of engaging with food pantries. The issue is it's so varied. There's no model that is really covers a large area. It's really dependent upon the individuals within those positions to engage with the pantries. And even then it can be hard, because pantries, the way they're structured, you have oftentimes a regional food bank and that distributes to individual pantries. And it's this really loose connection of individual organizations. So there's no real collaboration. And we've had a lot of pantry directors talk about that, like wanting to create a more collaborative model. And by doing that, you could maybe get more input and kind of engagement from those health departments, rather than going to an individual pantry that could distribute 5 different days a week, 5 different locations, and having a shared space, a collaborative space for individuals within a county even, I think could be a way to engage with that. But also finding a way to incentivize it. I know Extension does a really good job at times in Missouri, but it's really dependent upon the agent in that county to reach out, to engage, to make those connections, and then implement education. But also reframing, like they said, how we see or conceptualize the source of these issues going on, the health disparities in place, the causes of poverty. Part of my larger study actually looked at what were the assumptions of poverty that food pantry directors had. And I think through conversation, I actually have had a lot of food pantry directors identify really negative assumptions about the people utilizing their services. But when it came to the survey, they answered in ways I think that they felt more socially responsible or to answer, or they answered in a way they thought they had to, where they identified, yeah, it's these structural issues that are really at the source. But I think when it comes to acting on those things, there's a breakdown. Like, even if they do see it as structural, like, why? There's something going on there. And that is, I think, part of the next steps in some of my research is how do we move beyond that and really engage? Like, if you see the structure and see the larger issues people are facing, like, how can we use that as a catalyst for change? But that's
wow,
a really,
yeah. I mean, I think that's great, especially with the slide that you provide the information on the profile of the majority of pantry food directors being of a particular demographic, and that disconnect that happens, I think, between the people who are organizing these places and managing them with their clients and what those needs really are. Yeah, so Dean wants to know, I work for a community and school garden and orchard network, and we have an increasing number of projects growing just for food pantries, but we have been discussing how to engage more directly with food pantries. We have talked about many of the things you mentioned in terms of providing seeds, providing plants, etc. Do you offer consultation or information to other groups in Missouri trying to figure out how to do this sort of work?
Yeah, so Bill McKelvey, who I referenced earlier, is a part of our center and really was the central figure within Grow Well Missouri. I was a grad student working on that project, doing a lot of evaluation work and community engagement and kind of program rollout. And after the program ended, it transitioned into this kind of consultation model and trying to help people and pantries engage with these types of activities. I know that he has met with people in the past, and our center is more than happy to discuss some of those things. But if you also go to Food Security missouri.edu, there is a page for Grow Well Missouri, to where I think I believe it's still active, but all of our resources were up. They are Missouri specific when it comes to planting, growing calendars that we developed to help some of our gardeners, but there are a lot of resources there when it comes to education, to help with rolling out some of those programs. And then if you contact our center, someone will get back to you as well if you're interested in kind of having a discussion about like what are ways that we can engage with pantries that is most useful.
Wonderful. We have one question. This person wonders if you could repeat the definition for food insecurity.
Yeah, and that I will say there are a lot of different definitions out there, but the one I've held on to, which was used by USDA for a little while, is enough food, enough healthy food to live an active, healthy lifestyle. So it's looking not only at quantity, but quality.
Wonderful. So I'm wondering, this last question that we have here is, I'm wondering if you could talk about the transition on a larger scale to a grow local, buy, sell local model. Jerry says, if we can stop the cooperative, the world construct and focus on the grow local, buy, sell local, we would solve issues such as storage, cost, expense, quality, quantity available, and income earned by the producers. This is the very model my company is focusing on in our area as we work with small producers to become more sustainable. So this concept of creating more local food nexus to address not only emergency food situation, but just food access in general. I wonder if you could give us your thoughts on that.
Yeah, there's a really great book I read, More Than Just Food, which was a model, or sorry, let me rephrase, it's The Stop. Let me grab a book actually. So by Nick Zoll, really great book if you're looking at how to transition a food pantry emergency food model to incorporate more of this local food nexus type of approach. So it's really that transition like I was talking about, and pivoting from just seeing it as how do we distribute food that is coming through our system to looking at more structural issues. And so it's this reframing of the entire paradigm almost, but I think is really important. And we've seen some transitions here in Missouri where there's been partnerships with like CCUA, and the farmers market in Columbia has really developed a relationship with Central Pantry to do more of a distribution model of things that have been left unsold. But that comes to, even that, you aren't paying a producer necessarily, they are getting tax benefits from it, but it's that first step, I think, in thinking about how can we start engaging and looking at this local system where we have a lot of opportunity for production, but we aren't seeing people being compensated for the work that they're doing. And it is really difficult, but it comes from, I think, being steadfast in your change and stating like, these are the goals, the values that we have within the system, and we're changing it. And it can be really hard. In the book, Nick Zoll talks about how there was a lot of pushback from that change, and that they set the cap. They're like, we're not going to see distributing more pounds of food as our sign of success. We're going to look at the quality of that food and start re-envisioning our spaces to really support a model that we can include community kitchens, we can include more gardening and produce programs, even through our own pantry, and really investing in that at the individual, and then that grows to a little bit larger level. And it's really hard with the shoestring budget some pantries have, but I think it's also very possible. There's a friend of mine who's developing a pantry down in Jefferson City, Missouri, and they're starting it from scratch. and have really seen it as a community resource rather than a food pantry, and that the food that they distribute is only a part of the system. And it's really that re-envisioning that is going to provide space for including a local production and distribution as well.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic, and we have a really substantial contribution here from Peter to sharpen your point about reframing your area of concern under social justice. I'm writing from Canada. Here too, we have significant issues with food insecurity, and indeed, these statistics are an indictment of our society. But the picture you're painting of the US, the planet's wealthiest country, is nothing less than nightmarish, with absolute numbers of your citizens depending on food banks and pantries well in excess of my country's total population. Continues to say here, we're seeing a growing lobby for universal basic income moving into mainstream discourse, and which could possibly be realized in the wake of the pandemic. So your nightmarish scenario begs the question of what educated Americans are doing to step outside the very real concerns Americans involved in alternative food sourcing and consumption, to make food and economic security central to public discourse, along with the issues of climate change, pandemic, resurgence of fascism and racism. Peter, I think you make a really good point, and to really focus in on what I think is the key issue here. America is a wealthy nation, and I think in this conversation of emergency food, particularly in food access, some people, I say we more generally, we miss the point that there are so many hungry people in our own country, and we tend to cast our eyes elsewhere in the world to providing food for emergency situations and famine and drought and that sort of thing. But in fact, we have so many people here in our own country who struggle with hunger and access to food on a daily basis. So ultimately, I think the question here then is, what can we do to increase awareness and really change this perspective and shift it to turning our gaze inward, if you will?
Yeah, and I think that actually, I will also note that in my discussions with the food pantry directors this last year with COVID, the largest numbers of increases they were seeing weren't with existing clients. They weren't having people coming in more. What we were actually seeing was this rise in new clients who had never utilized food pantry services before, oftentimes in suburbs and often identified as middle-class neighborhoods or communities. And I think a lot of it comes from this change in what are basic human rights. And I think the pandemic has really provided an opportunity to see it is nightmarish. I hate to sugarcoat things, so I won't, but it's often glossed over with this idea that we're meeting need through charity. Like, there are gaps. Andy Fisher, there was a quote in my presentation, we have a shredded social safety net right now because of policies that have been implemented since the 1980s that have really decentralized the supports that were in place, put there through things like the New Deal, the war on poverty, and this historic support that we've seen through public assistance, and this transition to that reliance on a charitable model. And I think it comes from seeing and thinking about what are our basic human rights, access to health, to food, to safety. And I really hope that the pandemic has provided that opportunity a little bit, raised that discussion, but it has also, I think, created some divides, the nature of what's going on in the world. But I think there's hope. I'm hopeful for that opportunity for conversation, that people should have the basic right to food. We shouldn't have to worry about having a healthy, safe meal for a household, and access to healthcare, that it's just a basic level even. So I think that reframing is really critical, but we are kind of nightmarish, but it's been glossed over with this idea of individualism and triumph and like success that I don't think is the reality for a lot of individuals.
Yeah. But wonderful, man. I could talk about these issues for days. We are wrapping up. I think that's a great place to wrap up and put a pin in this. Once again, Darren, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and the conversation, and we look forward to engaging with you in the future.
Yeah, thank you all so much for your time. It was a pleasure.